How did you become interested in Jungian psychology? What's
Yeah,
the origin story behind that, if there is one?
yeah, yeah.
It's a good
I,
entry,
you
I
know,
think.
yeah, and do you want me to go ahead and jump in?
Sure.
Okay. So I became familiar with Jungian psychology before I was really confident in being able to apply the label Jungian psychology or archetypal psychology, depth psychology, analytic psychology. And my entree into it was through Joseph Campbell. So my undergraduate work focused on film studies and cinematography, and a significant amount of my time was spent interacting with Joseph Campbell and Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces and the hero's journey, and getting exposure to his 27 different character arcs that are associated with his version of the archetypes, and very quickly got exposed to, well, where is he pulling that from? And aside from his work in mythologies and the anthropologic work that he'd done across different monomyth stories, he would reference Jung pretty extensively in a lot of his later discussions and his lectures, and that drew me into this language of story. And I think that's really where, for me, being someone that liked the marriage between this analytic scientific mind and then also the irrational creative imagination mind, I found that within Jung. And and over time, as I started to read through his collected works, really in a pursuit of the archetypes and the inner workings of the human condition, uh, it led me eventually to the point where, having gone through all of the collected works in 2009, when the Red Book was published, and having access to this very raw material, there was a resonance there for me with Jung. His journey was very similar to some aspects that were in my own spiritual, personal, and professional journey as well. So I found a specific sense of identity with Jung and the way he thought about the world, which I think is not too different from a lot of people that read Jung and resonate with his genuine authenticity and vulnerability about himself, which I think the Red Book is a capstone in vulnerability. People who believed that what he was writing was a work of madness, those people existed. And in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, his semi-autobiography, where um, he worked to get that published, and there's still some things that people will consider, you know, may have been Jaffe uh, pushing a narrative of her own when she co-wrote that with him, still captured a really unique story that showed him breaking at that midlife point and moving much more towards that irrational spirit of the depths exploration. And again, when I reached midlife and went beyond, and then also dealt with other forms of crisis in my life, Jung was always, his language that he had developed was one that resonated with the language of my inner world as well. And so that's really what drove me from a personal perspective before, and professional in the cinematography space, before even now going into psychology and doing doctoral work in the space and anchoring my approach to depth psychology and Jungian archetypes. And that's really been the high level genesis of what has driven my interest with Jung.
Okay, that's a good that's a good introduction.
Good,
Yeah, so I
good.
guess the place to go now would be maybe into the specifics of what you're doing at the moment.
Yeah, so right now I'm currently focusing on doctoral work, uh, at early stages with master's level graduate work on licensure, so that I can continue to practice and conduct and participate in research around depth psychology. But the focus for me is getting even further into the exploration of what is the dance between the self, the individual, and then also the collective. And in my working hypothesis around that I'm working to test is that in at least in the United States and much of the Western world, our model for individuation, enlightenment, recovery, wholeness has been very much on that individualistic approach, which is to say that with one-on-one talk therapy or one-on-one therapy itself is we've isolated the causality that exists within the person themselves, and we give very little deference to the systemic or the collective issues. Most of our mental health systems in the United States are focused and stood up on a one-to-one model, and I'm looking more at a many-to-many model for recovery that would really lean into how it is that we bump into each other in the pursuit of wholeness within our own solitude. And so building out a lab that is focused on using Jungian archetypes, using the ability to uh, engage in active imagination in many a much more varied way, whether that's through woodworking, ceramics, or any number of other metaphors or analogs that allow us to bump into that and bump into others who are doing the same thing right next to us as a means for calling forth that unconscious, the soul, the inner teacher, whatever you want to call it, and using that as more of a synchronous model between the collective and the self, for what community can do to help people recover. And that's all through that approach of a root metaphor for me is Jung's theater of the interior. That there are the superior analogs or archetypes of animus and anima, persona and shadow that are causal to behavior and conducting research in a living lab of bumping into each other in community. And so that will take probably that's going to take the next 5 to 6 years for me in terms of continuing to conduct research and build out that thesis. And then PhD work is never complete. You just keep doing it until you die.
Hmm.
So that's the plan.
Yeah. So I guess the question, an obvious enough question would be, what do you think are the specific deficiencies or what is insufficient about the current sort of model of individual therapy? And because I can see how it can be quite a, yeah, it's very much like a individual journey that people go on, and they don't
Yeah.
necessarily, like you're saying, they don't necessarily bump into each other and share their experiences very often. But what
Yeah.
specifically for you is what makes it like inefficient or not inefficient,
Yeah.
insufficient? Sorry.
Yeah. 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 The first aspect of what makes it insufficient is that the current model is based on on modernity's view that getting as isolated as possible is a means for understanding causality. And so what if I look at even just the two of the major psychological forces throughout history, the psychotherapeutic model versus the humanistic model, for me, the main differentiation between those two is is the psychotherapeutic model still believes in a causal in the causal mechanisms for the development of human personality. And so you have the subjective experience and the objective experience that occurs within that model. And then you have the humanistic model, which is much more around doesn't abandon causality, but essentially says that causality isn't sufficient to drive the personality. And between those two models, I think you have an emphasis, at least in the West, that still has been on the causal model. And I think that that's a significant picture of why Jung broke away from Freud. One of the reasons was that idea that even within the causal model, Freud wanted to get as empirical and objective as possible to make it as scientifically based. And Jung recognized, well, that's even within the causal model, the subjective experience, that which you will never be able to fully observe or replicate, is still important. And so when I look at all the way back to where therapy has emerged in the United States and in the West, it has been an overemphasis on this belief that in the objective causal model, that empirical model, is that we can get all the way back to some degree of causes, whether those are through the mechanistic and reductionist view of going into our past and into our history as children and what we grew up with and addressing those. If we touch on those pieces, then we will drive towards healing, recovery, and wholeness by those alone. It is called the reductionist method, the mechanistic reductionist method, for very good reason. I don't believe that the individual can be reduced to its individual parts, because we are in context. We are beings that are in context, and that context, by and large, is our society, is the cultures in which we grow up. And so when I look at one-on-one therapy and its inherent philosophy is that we need to just drive down to the most basic parts, and then from there we will rebuild, I reject that. I think that drives more isolation. And I think when we look at the nature of not the delivery of mental health care in the West, but the actual current state of mental health in the US, we are not trending in a positive direction. The more fragmented that we have gotten, I would argue that fragmentation, that trying to reduce people to individual parts, to a formula that needs to be treated, is driving a form of isolation that is actually contributing to the mental health issues that we have, that are growing, in addition to many others. I don't want to be reductionist in my approach and say that's the only thing, but what I do believe is that actually getting to some degree of healing and wholeness requires not a reductionist approach that continues to isolate individuals and tell them that you need to fix you. It's actually in bumping into other people that are themselves seeking to recover on their own path. That is a very important mechanism for surfacing the aspects of ourselves that we can never uncover within individual therapy. It's the bumping into others and having things surfaced from the unconscious, being able to observe and become aware of those things. That's really important that we do that. It doesn't feel as expedient. In our model, what we want to say is that if we boil things down, if we control for the individual, which feels much more controllable, if we control for them, then we will be able to get to outcome. And I understand that the collective model where we bump into each other, it's hard to control for a whole bunch of other individuals who are they themselves at different stages of their own recovery. But I think that what we're leaving on the table is the fact that we were never supposed to isolate ourselves as a means for recovery, that it is a dance between the one-on-one work that we do in our solitude that is complemented by working within community and allowing things to surprise us, even if that's through kind of the concept of the Johari window, where the things that we don't know about ourselves that other people know about ourselves, well, we're only going to learn that by bumping into others that can reveal things about ourselves from a different perspective. It's a decentering. And so I advocate for the centering of the individual at the same time that we're decentering the individual, and that there's something in there that will that recovery and healing emerges more effectively through that model.
Okay. Yeah. So two things that come to my mind in terms of Jungian, big Jungian concepts. One is individuation, and the other is the collective unconscious. And a lot of people who maybe don't have such a deep understanding of the concept of individuation, they might think it's synonymous with individualism.
Yeah.
But my understanding is that Carl Jung believed that the process of individuation takes a person into, brings a person into contact with their own personal unconscious and ultimately the collective unconscious. And in so doing, connects the person with all the rest of humanity because the collective unconscious does just that. It's what unites everything. It's the substratum psychologically of the whole of humanity. So the paradox of the individual focusing on their individual journey, and then this collective is somehow bridged by the collective unconscious. Is that would that does that sound correct to you?
Yeah, they're definitely, yeah, components there that resonate with what we were talking before. What about that nature of the bumping into each other? Well, we that that is so important because of the collective unconscious. That nature of the unitive, right, is that there are things that connect us. There are things that there's ways that other people will elect to be in the world, their own persona, their own outward expression, the alchemy that exists between them and their own attachment to deep-seated themes like archetypes. You know, we talk about different characters and have archetypes because necessarily because those things themselves have value in and of themselves. They have value because of the relationships that emerges between the fool and the sage. That there's something that happens between that actually the fool and the sage don't exist without each other. And that the collective unconscious is this aspect that says, you know, deep within the recesses of what resonates and what must come out. Well, what is it resonating with? What's the frequency it's resonating with? And the observation of, even at its most basic, within the animus and the anima, the female or the feminine energy versus the masculine energy, setting aside current identity politics and just saying that that's a framework for looking at differentiation between two, what we can say is either opposing forces or collaborative forces, that they exist and emerge in the absence or the loudness of the other, and that's constantly happening. And so why does it happen? I mean, in this metaphor of these balancing of opposites, that's what we would argue is that a key component that Jung even recognized within individuation was that phrase, the reconciliation of opposites. That what he felt was he navigated a world where one, he was a champion for one opposite at the detriment of the other. This was his language at that part in his life where he was starting to evaluate his life choices. He even started to reach for some of his early discussion around the collective unconscious, even with what he saw, that the collective unconscious was highly focused on this spirit of the times, this masculine energy that was highly productivity focused. And what he felt within himself was there was a dissonance that was emerging. And what was that? He named it that, spirit of the depths, the timeless components. And those, even at that high level classification of the collective unconscious, the reason it came to life was because of the themes that he found in his own life. And and in using the collective, what was happening in the world, and we won't even get to what happened when, pre World War One and his discussion on what he started to see happening in the collective unconscious there. But for himself, what he started to see in that dance within himself as he bounced up against the world around him was he saw that he was being pulled towards this reconciliation of those two things, even within himself, and ultimately got to a point where he said that that reconciliation, that is a key component of becoming individuated, of waking up, of becoming enlightened, of becoming whole, healed, a self-actualized person. Individuation, as a definition, has had many different terms attached to what it means. And Jung was not shy about saying that he believed that in the course of life, it was a very small percentage of people that would reach that level of full, complete individuation. But the purpose of life, of time itself, was to be in process on that path. And the tools of the themes and the archetypes within the collective unconscious, as well as the themes and the archetypes of how they resonate and replicate themselves inside the individual, that is a language that helps to drive towards that form of indivision, of wholeness. Yes.
Okay. That's a good that's a lot to think about. So
Yes. Yeah.
so in terms of your what your work or your what you plan on doing is would be using these archetypes to help nurture individual people's their individual journey, but at the same time to do that in a sort of shared space with other people, sort of sharing their
Yeah.
experiences. And
Yeah.
this is like as this is the idea is that this would essentially this would maybe speed up the process is the wrong word, but maybe make the process more integrated with society in a broader sense. Or what's the
Yeah.
in terms of obviously we have this very nebulous concept of individuation, which is quite nebulous for some people, and I think a lot of people have different
Hmm.
definitions of what it is, but I think most people have at least an
Hmm.
intuitive sense of what it is. And like you're saying, there's Jung had this idea that there's sort of a spectrum, isn't it? There's early developmental psychology, and that leads all the way. You just keep going with the developmental process, and that's where it's going. That's the
Yeah.
teleology, to use a big word, of that
Hmm.
process. Is it's all
Yeah.
going towards this individuation. This
Hmm.
so in terms of um, what do you imagine? Say if these ideas you're working on, if they were to come to their full fruition, what kind of scenarios could you imagine coming out of that in terms of like what would it look like?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that there are there are subtle things that we in the West, ways that we talk about the nature of wellness, of healing, of recovery, of wholeness, that we fail to realize. Again, this goes back to, we fail to realize how much we place on the individual in terms of driving that activity, that individuation activity. So much of it is, yeah, I'll reference another philosopher. He's a contemporary German philosopher. His name's Byung-Chul Han. Byung-Chul Han does really good diagnostic work to paint a picture about what it is that's leading to, and then he goes through a number of symptoms that are a part of our relative parlance, burnout being one of them. His first essay was The Burnout Society, and he writes a number of essays that talk about the disappearance of ritual. He talks about the nature of what how we treat time and what our relationship is to time. He has a book, an essay called "The Scent of Time," and I think that we are similar to Jung, and actually going back to some of the visions he recorded that he had around the advent of World War II and of World War One, and then on to World War II, is that he saw patterns. He saw patterns of human behavior. He saw it across civilization, and he recognized that there's certain times throughout history, and I think we're all feeling this is one of those intense times where the nature of humanity, what it means to be human together and as individuals, the language of archetypes, I think, does a very good job of breaking through the noise of policy arguments of which side is winning, and recognizing that there are very specific themes that are emerging right now that help get us to ask, what is going on? Like, is this the end of the world? Is this is something something is shifting? And I think Jung's language has been forgotten, but in the same way that other wisdom traditions have been forgotten as well. Because, whether you're talking about Taoism that says, there's a period of time where turmoil and the swirling of the water and the muddiness is at its height. And it needs to be at its height because in order to get clarity, in order to search for clarity, you have to learn how to settle. You need to learn how to quiet the spirit. You need to learn how to engage with silence. If I was to describe our present history, silent would not be one of the words that I would use, especially when you consider that every single platform is a platform for giving voice to everyone. We are drowning in a lot of noise, and this goes back to Byung-Chul Han. He'll argue is that we have turned expression and creative expression into a commercial endeavor that is a competitive marker of us being constant projects of ourselves. And I think these are things that all of us feel. We are constantly being measured by our economic utility, by how productive we can be. We are constantly looking for what's the next thing. We end a project and we're right back to beginning another project. These are the same things that Jung was saying, for what? What is that yielding for itself? And so for me, I think that at this point in time, the work that I'm doing is anchoring back to Jung and other wisdom traditions that says we need to learn how to sit in silence with ourselves. We need to learn how to sit in silence with each other. We need to learn how to sit in silence because we also need to cultivate listening skills. These are pragmatic things that when we look out at, if we described our current generations and what we're good at and what we're not good at, we're not good at listening. We're not good at exploring the stories, at getting curious. We are anchored to the very archetypes that are associated with fear, with zero-sum thinking, with making sure that we get as much as we possibly can. We're really anchored to the linearity of time, acting as if what we do here, we just got to get as much as we can before we hit the dirt. Well, the parts that we're being called back to is that actually legacy matters. Actually building into the future matters. That my immortality actually can be realized by investing in others around me. Well, one of the things that I anchor to really strongly that we're going to be that we're advocating for with our research is around what's the infrastructure that's needed for individuation, for wholeness, for healing, to have the best opportunity. What are the conditions we need to start cultivating? I think an apprenticeship model is needed. And when you look at Jung and all of the areas that he went and he looked at, whether it was, Hinduism and the Bhagavad Gita and Taoism and even alchemy and Gnosticism, all of those anchored to more of an apprenticeship model, which said that over time, life is not a move from birth to death. And going back to, even you mentioned James Hollis, at its most basic, James Hollis would even say life is at least two lives. You get to experience birth and then death at least twice. You have the physical birth, and then you have the death of midlife, where you enter this liminal phase that says, like, you're even going to thrash around this idea of, is my life going to end? It's this almost reconciliation with what death is going to look like, the physical death. But midlife is a form of death itself, of the first half of your first life. And Jung's language was the same, is that you build up the persona, and then the rest of, after your midpoint, you are reconciling with putting to death that persona and stepping into a different life that is more unified, that is more whole. Those are the kinds of things that, even anecdotally, in my coaching business that I do right now, I talk with a number of individuals that are hitting this point of midlife, and they're using the language that says, my soul is being crushed. I don't know who I am. I don't know what I should be doing with the rest of my life. They're asking the same questions. And I think Jung was asking those questions himself. He just was finding a language that would resonate with people, and it would resonate with them because it was the language that had been used by wisdom traditions for millennia. And I believe, and this is kind of where the root metaphor holds my faith, is that I think that's a storytelling. There's something about story within us that resonates. Like, we are story-driven creatures. And Jung's approach with the archetypes being these characters in this theater of the interior and the theater of the collective, it resonates very deeply with something that within our human condition that says we need story. We need the all of the components of story, and we're looking to write our own story. And the first half is about writing the story with us at the center of the story. The second half is about finding that, oh, we're the center of our story, but we're also supporting characters in the centered stories of many other people. And that's a paradoxical aspect that says there's no clean answers for that. I think people are clamoring for, even in the turmoil that we see, in the fights of the polarized, the fights that we see, I think at its core, what I'm hearing is people crying out for meaning that is embraced by paradox much better than the clean packaged answers of left or right, or the extreme poles that we see. That's what I see in how things are going to evolve over the next 5 to 10 years. I think we're in the process of moving back to a form of remembering what it means to be human as individuals and together.
Yeah, that's that all resonates with me for sure. One thing it made me sparked in me was this idea about, you were talking about the midlife transition and transitions in general. And one of the thing Jung points out is that older civilizations, I mean that's the wrong word, but more traditional cultures, they were a lot better in a lot of ways. They were better in a lot of ways at handling transitions and demarcating transitions and making people conscious, consciously ritualizing and making ceremonies to honor these natural human transitions, like from childhood to adulthood, and obviously different transitions depending on if you're male or if you're female. But we have a real poverty of those those sort of ceremonies or rituals in modern society. I mean, some people still have sort of something I mean, in some religious situations, people have some, but it's really not what it is in these other societies or cultures. And so something about, and you were talking about even helping people in your coaching, and there's something very powerful about uh, being able to help someone acknowledge that they're going through something, which is a very human, universal situation, these transitions. And that has this effect, which Jung talked about a lot, of sort of freeing someone from a neurotic sense of isolation, that they are going through something which is somehow unique to them and is an indictment on their worth as a human. And and by showing people that actually you're having an archetypal experience. And this has been known about and talked about for as long as people have talked about things. And there's something about that which is extremely therapeutic. To like you said, to takes you out of this sort of isolated sense of it's just you, and it's hard to explain what it does for you, but it it lifts a burden off you in some really profound way when you realize that what's happening to you, has happened to a lot of people. As it's a human universal experience.
Mm-hmm.
So that's in my own personal experience with engaging with archetypal material. That's been some of my experiences. It's not that I could put it all into words or even a fraction of it into words, but that sense of like, oh, I'm part of something which is larger. My experience, it somehow it validates your experience because it says your experience is, it's not this one-off sort of anomaly that you've run into. No, it's like it's a right. And there's
Yeah.
something about, this idea of like it takes you from looking at an experience as if it's just something wrong that shouldn't be happening to actually, you could even look at it in a way that this experience has something sacred about it. There's something deeply meaningful about it. And just that change of perspective, I mean, it's still suffering. It's still really hard experience, but just having that different perspective, it makes all the difference in the world. It makes all the difference. And so, I mean, that's, I guess, in my experience, that would be an example of how these sort of collective archetype stuff from the collective unconscious has this impact on an individual, this sort of uniting, bringing because it takes you from this position of unnecessary sense of isolation. And
Yeah.
so,
I think what you just said, I mean, I'll choose one of the classic archetypes, which is known by a number of different names. One of which is the Hierophant or the Lesser Creator, the Demiurge. This is the this is the creator god that was involved with bringing things to life and building the world. And then because he built the observable world, he believes he is the ultimate supreme meaning, to use a Jung phrase. And what he doesn't know is that no, there's actually there's something beyond that. There's something nameless, there's something timeless that is beyond the observable world. And and that is a picture for us of what we do to ourselves. What our ego ends up being is a hierophant. It believes that its job is to protect and provide stability by building up the persona, establishing the personality, and saying like this will make you happy. And it's almost this aspect that says, well, you kind of have to be convinced of that in order to give it power. But then you start to learn is that those things that it built, the things that when you look out and they look stable, whether that's your career, whether that's your identity and how you introduce yourself, whether that's your family, whether it's all of the trappings that you believed you structured that define who you are, is that if those things were to be stripped away and to fall away, for many of us, we feel that, well, I disappear as well. If everything that is a part of how I define myself, when someone says, it goes to introduce themselves. When I go to introduce myself, I say based on the job that I do, that I'm a father, that I'm a husband, all of these different things. If all of those were to go away, does that mean that Tyler disappears? And inherently we say no. But the question then is, if everything did disappear, do I know what's left? Am I familiar? Am I conversant with that part? And for many people, the answer is no. In fact, when I talk with people who are terrified, those same people who are saying my soul is being crushed and I need to do something different, if I tell them, what's keeping you from saying no to working, 8 extra hours on the weekend? It's, well, their response oftentimes is, well, one, that potentially could put at risk all of the frameworks, all of my identity structures, or I don't know what I would do with myself. Because if I have to sit with myself, alone with myself, or figure out what I actually want to do, I don't have an answer for that. So everything you said in terms of those things of that are driving growth, I think ultimately we have a question, we have a core question we must ask when these things start calling and we start feeling that sense of dissonance. One of which is, do we even have the courage for starting to pursue or to explore what lies at the heart of that? And I think this is why Jung said individuation is not for the faint of heart. It requires deep courage, is because when you actually start going down that path and exploring some of these things, some of those identity structures that we have, that we put so much faith in, they themselves our faith in them starts to crumble. And there's no promise on the other side that says, if I walk away from my career because it is the very thing that is not a part of my expression, or if I even start to explore my relationship with that career in a way that starts to make me dissatisfied, even more dissatisfied with it, there's no guarantee on the other side that I'm going to find wholeness. I have to forge that path for myself. How do I forge that path without knowing that there's some promise at the end of recovery? I think this is where it's the importance of other people walking alongside with us that have been down this path before is so critical. And we do not have that in our credentialist model. In fact, we have a model that says, at least in the West, when you turn 18, hey, if you want to be, if you want to be an elected official, go ahead. In your town, go ahead. We don't even question, are you even equipped with the authority or the skills to do that? And it makes me think about in Australia, Aborigines have an initiation practice with young males where they take them out and they say, you need to go build your own axe. And they go out and they're taught how to do that, and they have to go forge it on their own. There's guidance. There's eldership that watches, but they have to go and build it on their own. And when they build it and they come back, it doesn't belong to them. They first have to demonstrate that they have the maturity and understand that they must use that tool. They must use this credential, this thing that they built. They must use it for their benefit and for the benefit of the community in which they're going to belong. And sometimes there are young men who they built this axe, it's not given to them. They must do more maturing at the behest of the elders in the tribe. And that practice was decimated when European settlers came and they saw this activity going on, and they said, well, this isn't good. We have axes, mass-produced axes. We're going to give them to everyone so that they can be more productive. Your credential was the fact, can you swing an axe?
Hmm.
Yes. All right. That's a significant credential enough for us. Here's the axe. Go start to produce. And I think that that's much more the model that we live right now, where if you have a credential, if you have a degree, if you've done those things that says I've earned, I've followed the formula. Well, then we start giving you responsibility without deference for what it actually means to wield the authority and the responsibility that comes along with titles, with roles. And I think we are all feeling that the credentialist model has its own form of isolation that we're calling back and saying, like, I want a mentor. I want an elder. I want somebody else who's actually been there before to come alongside and help me understand, am I walking into a buzzsaw, or am I is this a normal level of struggle that's helping to shape me, or am I making things worse not only for myself but for the people around me in a very detrimental way? I think that we've lost that aspect of eldership, and I think these are things that Jung recognized through his corpus as well.
Yeah, for sure. What it makes me think of is basically one of the main distinctions between modern society as it exists and these older traditional societies or communities. I'm not sure what to call them. But one of the main differences is that they had wisdom traditions. They had some sense of spiritual grounding. They had a cosmology of sorts. So they could actually they could have a conversation about maturity or wisdom. We don't really broach that subject in modern society very much. Well, wisdom or maturity, because we don't really have any. It nearly seems like you have to have some kind of a cosmological grounding to even talk about these things. Like in this post-enlightenment modernity, what does that even mean? That's, the postmodernists would come in and they'd pick it apart and say, nothing to these concepts. What is maturity? What is wisdom? These are just attempts to gain power by arbitrary, that sort of way of breaking things down. And that's what happens. Seemingly, that's what happens when there isn't anything connected with these concepts in terms of something transcendent or something which undergirds the physical facts of reality or the kind of gross apparent nature of things. So all of these other older traditional cultures, I think that's basically universal. They had some kind of a sense of spiritual grounding, some kind of a sense of the gods. They had some version of that. They had a creation story that they took seriously. They had a sense of, we don't have really any of that for the most part. I mean, some people do. I don't want to generalize too much, but the sort of zeitgeist, the spirit of the modern civilization that we're in is kind of bankrupt of that sort of thing. We're sort of, we are kind of cosmologically, spiritually bankrupt. Metaphysically, our metaphysics are, it's hard to derive when you have the metaphysics that our civilization has. It's hard to argue for wisdom or maturity. I'm sure people do it, but it's more difficult. Or it seems like there's something to that. Not sure what you think about that.
No, it's there's a couple of things that come up for me with that is just the nature of how we got to where we are, the nature of how I'm sitting here in the middle of North America is through an ancestry of escapism. It's through an ancestor. So what is the archetypal story that's associated with that? Oftentimes, I think of the lotus flowers. There's this idea that we have, whether it's the language of the promised land in the Torah, and or whether it's the lotus flowers of, there's something else out there that if I'm not happy right here where I am, Well, then at least maybe there's something out there. There's some Shangri-La, there's some Nirvana, there's some enlightenment. And that's kind of actually what I would say is even the co-opting of some of the language in the West around awakening and enlightenment and nirvana and is almost, it reconciles this idea of I can find the fountain of youth out there, and that's what I'm striving for, rather than sitting with whatever brokenness exists. I mean, from a United States perspective, is that we had the language of religious and metaphysical and spiritual persecution was justified for us to leave. If you look at the record for what drove the Puritans and others to the United States, from Europe, you would say, wow, groups have endured far worse things that they needed to escape from than some of the actual records of religious persecution that was happening in Europe at the time. I find it to be much more of a human adolescent view that says, well, if I can't find what I need over here, then I'm going to go across the Atlantic Ocean and I'm going to believe that it's going to be there. And what did they run into? They ran into another group that actually believed they had found some degree of contentment. And those Puritans said, no, actually, we know what contentment is. We've just escaped over here. We couldn't find it there, but we've brought it over here. And I think there's a nature of us actually evaluating what's the degree of brokenness that we have transmitted over time. And when we start talking about some of these older wisdom traditions that come from indigenous tribes or from religious traditions, there is a reconciliation with the idea amongst all of them that life is hard. Like, you're not going to escape from life being hard. In the United States, we have entire cottage industries. We have billions and billions of dollars that are focused on this myth that life can be easy. And I think that's more of a picture of the dynamic that we have in many ways within modernism, within the promise of the Enlightenment, was crack the code, figure out the algorithm, and you can avoid pain and suffering. Just figure out the correlation coefficients, run enough tests, and you can figure out the right formula that's going to make you happy. At its most aggrandized, figure out the perfect formula and you can avoid death. That drives so much. That statement or understanding for me drives so much of an understanding for how much of the West works, which is a lot of what we do is seeking to escape death. And the lotus flower is the myth that we can escape death. And at its core, what Jung and James Hollis and so many of these wisdom traditions said is that death, as long as you continue to make death the bogeyman, you aren't ruled, you aren't actually submitting and surrendering to expression and creativity and everything that makes us reach for the highest versions of our humanity. You are worshiping death because it is what has you enslaved to your activity. And I think that's the part that a lot of those indigenous or wisdom traditions got right, which is that it is that confronting our mortality. It is the looking it in the face and saying, I don't need to fear you. I don't need to be beholden to the belief that you are so terrifying that I'm going to make avoiding you and all your flavors, suffering, pain. That's actually going to be what rules my life. Everything I'm going to do is going to be seeking the avoidance of those, including this promised land that's out there somewhere and I can escape the desert. No, I'm going to learn how to make the desert my home. And in so doing, I put down roots because that's the only way to reach for real connection and real sustenance in the desert. And what I'm going to find when I do that, when I stop fearing death, that's the moment that I find life. And I think that picture is actually what is wrapped up in the midlife, which is that the moment that I stop reaching for the title that's going to finally make me happy, the responsibility, the paycheck that's going to make me happy, and I just find my sense of belonging where I am, well then I start to live a different life.
Yeah, that's that all resonates with me. But to me, I just keep coming back to this basic thing of I think we have a kind of a gloomy metaphysical picture, and I think that plays a role in this because it's like Alan Watts talks about, if you have a conception of yourself as just this sort of you're this just this bag of skin. What I forget the exact phrase he uses, but you're just this little individual sort of sack of skin, and when you die, it's a wrap. It's like there's a perspective. All the stuff you're talking about living a life where your only goal is to minimize pain and maximize pleasure. There's a perspective. There's a philosophy or a point of view where that makes sense. And I think it's like in terms of you look at why would you live like that? And it's like, why would you live doing everything you can to avoid um, suffering or pain or psychological death. Part of it is because you are convinced there's nothing after it. There's no redeeming quality to it. Whereas these older cultures, they have this, like, for instance, one of the archetypal patterns is fairly universal is the archetype of the great mother or the earth mother. And that's connected with the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, the eternal round, the great round, whatever it's called.
Yep, the Ouroboros.
Yeah, and it's just they have this sort of very clear conviction that life follows death, and that when something dies, when something ends, something begins, and so they're kind of. Whereas in the West, I think we have a fairly grim sort of, zero sum attitude, like just get yours while you can. Everything is going to hell. There's no redemption going to happen here. And this, you could take that down to an individual level where you think, well, you know, if I may as well just hang on to what I have because I'm not going to get anything else. If I lose what I have, that's it. So all of that is really connected to what's your basic beliefs or uh, maybe unconscious beliefs about the nature of reality, about how things work. So
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to. I sometimes I struggle with this idea that to what degree is it possible to um to bring things around, so to speak, to live a life, for instance, where you're not just avoiding pain and seeking pleasure. To what degree is that possible without there being some significant alteration in your basic metaphysics or your
Mm.
basic views about the nature of reality? Because I'm aware, obviously, there are people out there and for instance, they are atheists and they live a really life affirming lives. Their influence is really positive. I think of like David Attenborough. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I could go down a list, but the point is that clearly you don't need to have a specific metaphysics, at least not in this sense, not in the sense of I am an atheist or I am a Christian or I'm a whatever, in order to have a life which is life affirming, which is really. So I'm trying to sometimes puzzle out what is it exactly? What is the essential thing that allows someone to live in a life affirming way, in a way where in a sort of a generative. I mean, one of the ways you think about archetypally would be nearly a sacrificial life. And you using the Jungian framework is like a life where you're willing to, let yourself or let parts of you die in order to feed this cycle of death and renewal. And because I can clearly see there are people who have, on the surface at least, there are people who identify with as this, as a whatever, agnostic, atheist, whatever, all across the board. You will find examples of people, living, not doing that or doing that. And so it does make me curious. What's the essential difference there? What's going on the unconscious level, maybe? Because obviously, because we align with some conscious philosophy, we can't necessarily take that at face value that this represents the structure of this person's unconscious, which is more, if we go back to Jungian psychology, the structure of your unconscious is the real driving force. It's the real thing that is, responsible for people's actions and in the world. So that's just a thing which I've pondered that on many occasions. What is it? Because I go through that cycle of thought process. Okay, maybe there's something about the crises related to human behavior, related to sort of nihilistic tendencies in humans. There's something about that related to our metaphysics, but at the same time, you can always pull out these examples where seemingly people identify as, oh, I'm definitely a physicalist. I believe there's no transcendent metaphysics, there's none of that, and yet they will have very positive influence on the world. And so it makes me, I mean, like one angle is what I brought up already, which is that's a conscious point of view, and it might not necessarily tell you what's going on the unconscious level. But I'm not sure if you have any ideas about that. It's just a random thought that popped in my head.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. Really interesting paths to pull. I think the first thing that comes up for me is sometimes it is helpful to take the negative versus the positive approach, which is what are the things that for me and through the lens of Jung and through others that I find to have moved past that sense of naive wisdom, that are actually reaching for and in process of reaching for real tangible wisdom. One of those things is that the nature of an arrival point as being, hey, I've reached the top of the mountain. This is it. This like that I usually, when I'm talking with others, I'm usually gauging, are they at a point where whatever their ism is, whatever is that they believe, they treat it as, I've arrived. I've got it all figured out. And so what does that indicates to me? It's the absence. The negative of that is like you've sacrificed a portion of your humanity, which is some of the most kind of divine aspects of our humanities, is that we're able to imagine possibilities. We're able to be creative with things that don't exist yet, to imagine worlds that have yet to come to pass. And so for those that, I do believe that there's a difference between that person who defines themselves as an agnostic or an atheist, or who their relationship to that label itself is either as a arrival point, and therefore typically what I find is when it's an arrival point, it's their sense of security and grounding. They've defined it as, this is what it is that I believe. And instead of saying, this is what I believe for now, because it's the vehicle for how I'm exploring and continuing to be in process of becoming. Instead, they say, that's my identity. That is where I'm going to stop. It is unshakable. And I think I've seen those versions of individuals both in highly religious domains and in atheist or scientific domains, where science itself almost becomes their religion. In the language of Jung, he even distinguished between this. Now, he distinguished between this, between being creedal and beholden to a creed versus being religious. The language of today is that we would distinguish that religion, or organized religion, is that dogmatic, staid approach versus spiritual, which is a little bit more exploratory and curious. I find both of them to be very denotative of the human condition. One is that we as humans, we want to know, especially in a post enlightenment world, is that we want to believe that we can figure things out. But for me, I anchor to the idea of my relationship to time. I'm much more reticent to even decide what is good and what is bad, because that's based on a time horizon. I mean, if I'm at its most mundane, if I'm downstairs lifting weights in order to keep my body healthy, the present experience, if I'm using just the present uh, of just the near future of 30 to 45 minutes of lifting weights, it's painful. I don't like it. And if I was to base my cosmology based on that time horizon, then I would say this equals bad. I am an anti working out. That's where I stand. But I know that through wisdom that there's things beyond the present experience that is going to yield benefits that are in line with my values. So if I if I hold out that line that says, "Oh, I'm healthier and I'm able to take care of my special needs daughter more effectively for a longer period of time, now it's good." Well, if I'm working out and then I injure myself and I'm unable to, does the fact that I got injured make my choice to work out then bad simply because I'm bad? Like we're now into that Taoist Cohen that is the farmer who is finds a horse, loses his horse, and his friends come and say like, well, it's this is bad, right? And his response, who knows what is good or bad?
Yeah,
And the next
maybe.
day, yes, exactly, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe. And then he goes out looking for his horse and he finds a herd of horses and he's got 5 horses and one of them is a Mustang and he comes back and they say, wow, look at the boon that you've received from this. Is this good or bad? Yes, maybe. Who knows what is good or bad? His son rides the horse, breaks his arm. Oh, this is bad. How like and it's like how many times through this cycle of something happening and us wanting to define it as good or bad do we get to the point where we say like, who am I to define what is good or bad? And I'm going to hold that in abeyance because yes, we have to make decisions today. I have to make a decision about what I esteem to be good or bad today. But I can only do that based on what's given to me today. For me to cosmologically say what I have today, the perspective I have today is sufficient for all of time for me to declare this is what truth is, shuts down a part of my humanity that also is beholden to time that is going to unfold over time, circumstances that are going to unfold, and that I am going to be I'm in process. And what is served up today is sufficient for me to get to the next stage. But I'm very reticent to anchor to any ism as sufficient to hold my human experience. I'm going to continue. I can say right now, this is where I am today, but I must hold these things loosely because tomorrow I may be confronted with something new that completely undermines. It doesn't take away the virtue and the value of what holding something and knowing something today, what it delivers me. Bernoulli's principle was sufficient for us to get to a point where we started to understand that flight was possible, that you could actually develop the camber of a wing so that it would cause lift. But once you get over 150 miles an hour and you get further and further and faster, Bernoulli's principle falls apart. Does that mean that we denigrate Bernoulli's principle? No. It was sufficient to get us from this point to this point, and it holds in that area. But it does fall apart, and I'm that's where I am is that at this point we're saying like, what is it within our humanity, that we want to get to that great unifying theory that just describes and defines everything. And I'm much more interested in the context of this is sufficient for this
Mm.
context, but the minute that it stops being sufficient for this context, it doesn't demean it. It just means explore, get curious,
Yeah.
stop trying to force fit that model to this model.
So a couple things have popped into my mind there, and one is sort of based on what you're saying. It's nearly like we have this wish for the known to completely and permanently overtake the unknown.
Mm.
So it's like part of our desire is to really to eliminate the unknown, and for the total dominion, total dominance of the consciousness, the known. And so, yeah, in relation to the depth psychological lens of the conscious and the unconscious, it's like ego just wants to expand its territory to encompass everything. Everything will be known. But yeah, so back to my original question about what is the essential difference between people, if it's not their conscious metaphysical views that they, like you're saying, their creeds, what is it about them that is this essential difference in how they live their life, and if their life is life affirming or if it's ultimately in the other direction? And it seems like, based on what you're saying, two things. One is relationship to mystery. So to what degree does mystery factor into your perspective? What sense do you have of an underlying mystery in your existence or in reality? And then the other, which is kind of hand in hand with that, I suppose, is the ability to hold your current understanding in a provisional way, to be able to see that, yes, you have an understanding, you need an understanding in order to proceed, but to be able to be okay with the idea that everything you know is ultimately provisional. And there's a very high likelihood that at some point in the future, it'll become obsolete or replaced by something else. And so I could definitely, that's helpful to think that maybe what's more important, and if you think about it, um, these ideas about, having a spiritual metaphysics, really true spirituality, or like you're saying, Jung's the difference he points out between creed, having a genuine religious attitude, and just being subscribed to a certain creed, is to do with the phenomenology of the experience, to do with to what degree are you in contact with, you know, the mystery, really, with, with the gods, or with the numinous, or with that which is beyond your your understanding, your current conception of reality. And so, yeah, it's more easy for me to see how just because someone identifies as this or that, that doesn't tell you about what's their relationship with mystery.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
I think what you just said, there's a couple of things. One is like there are celestial bodies that we discovered them um without actually seeing them visually. We saw them by we essentially suggested or started to believe, oh, there's something there because of the behavior that we saw of other celestial bodies around them. And that was the nature of gravity, right? Like gravity, the fact that gravity exerted forces on other bodies, when we saw bodies that weren't behaving the way they should be based on what we saw, what we observed, we said like this one's orbit is this, but it's orbiting around this other celestial body, and if it was just orbiting around that celestial body, then it should look like this, but it looks a little bit different. It kind of comes out of orbit. There must be something else there. And I think that the reason I bring this up is because within us, and I think this is one of those areas why archetypes for me are so powerful, is that a lot of the things that we seek to define about ourselves, the ways we interact with the world scientifically, the way we build a case, the way we preference certain information with confirmation bias, the things about the human condition for me is almost like defining the archetype or preference or yearning within ourselves, the gravitational pull that says there's something within me that I want to, that needs to come out. Sometimes I interact with people that I will click with certain individuals for some reason that is yet to be discovered. But what I find is that there's some gravitational pull between us, that there's some language between the way that I show up and navigate this world, the way that person shows up and navigates the world, that's just complementary. And then there's others, it's oil and water. Like it doesn't fit together. Well, does that mean that that person is wrong and I'm right, or that the person that I do gravitate to is right and I'm right? And well, I think that's the way oftentimes we do navigate the world, is that we forget that because we have certain predilections and preferences towards some languages, towards the way some things are packaged, towards some principles or metaphors that resonate with us that may not resonate with others, that we get down to the business instead of codifying our preferences, and simply because they make sense to us, well, they should make sense to everybody else. And I think that, for me, defines a lot of the power struggle, not only within the world, but then also within myself. I end up doing that to myself in some respects. The ego itself and the transcendent function. Jung's essay on the transcendent function, and what he talks about is the nature of this gravitational pull between the ego, we'll call it that, and the unconscious contents. And that there's a certain threshold that the ego, if it ever has a belief that it's what it believes and what's holding it together is under threat by the unconscious contents, it has every weapon in its arsenal trained on suppressing those unconscious contents. And one of the questions that he asks is, so how do we get those to surface? I think this goes back into developing the awareness and using archetypal language. Science has archetypal language. It is full of symbols that hold meaning, that just because we named them something doesn't automatically mean they are empirically accurate. We assigned that construct. The laws of thermodynamics are not laws. Dividing by zero is actually not a law. We actually can. It's just that our world starts to unfold when we do. But the quantum world starts to get propped up when you just start dividing by zero. The world of the infinite starts to get propped up and we start to understand it differently. I think these are the things that we start forgetting, that in that sense of, well, going back to what you said, in that sense and search for changing from not knowing to knowing, is that if we make knowing the be all end all, we miss a whole lot of the rest of the world, of the rest of the experience, which is that dance with the mystery. That there are that even if we find a placeholder, a provisional placeholder for something that we believe, even gravity itself. What if we find out that the nature of gravity, what we call gravity, has more nuance associated with it? Does that, well, it was sufficient for what we needed for the time. And I think the second part of your question, which is how do you hold those things provisional? I don't have a simple answer for that. For me, I can share my story, which is my journey was punctuated with significant trauma. And I mean, that moment of significant trauma, catastrophe involving my world being decimated overnight, put me into a position that said, wow, everything that I believed was solid, was firm, was grounding, that disappeared overnight. And I think for many people, that's, whether it's that kind of tragedy or even within science, we have stories within science where people believed things wholeheartedly, And one thing was sufficient to poke a hole in everything they believed. And they go through, in some cases, existential crises because now they're stuck in this. Do I hold on to everything I've worked for, or do I follow this pinprick that is slowly or rapidly deflating the world that I had erected around me? And do I learn how to hold it loosely, or do I go through the process of trying to hold on to it and reestablish it and restructure it? In our case, we had to go through a period of trying to hold everything together, of trying to hold tighter. And I think that that's a part of my answer to that second question is the process of becoming will I actually trust will serve up what's needed. And sometimes we need to try to reconstruct our worlds in good, believing that we need to shore up the holes that have been poked in our paradigm, only to be taught that there's no amount of the cracks are emerging too quickly to a point that maybe what we need to do is start from go again. Start at the beginning and get curious. And sometimes that takes our world crumbling around us first before we're finally convinced to, okay, let's look at it with fresh eyes, with beginner eyes. And that's the nature of wisdom that we all know. The nature of mastery that we say is like masters are those that maintain a beginner's mindset, that actually behave like the fool because it keeps them curious, it keeps them open. It doesn't denigrate the wisdom that they actually have. It just keeps them in a place of holding things loosely. I think that's probably the closest to an answer that I can get of where I am. You'd have to ask me probably another 10 years and see if that's evolved.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So one thing that occurs to me is like you were answering this question, how do you maintain or how do you get to this sense of one way to talk about it is epistemological humility. So this
Mm-hmm.
sense of holding all of your sense of reality as being ultimately provisional. How do you get there, you know? And I mean, it sounds like it's not necessarily possible that we can will ourselves into that situation. But one thing that to me, I guess what occurs to me is perhaps the most terrifying thing about having the sense that everything is provisional is this sort of terror of sort of just collapsing into nothingness.
Mm.
It's like the Jungian, famous Jungian quote. I think it's, um, what supports you when nothing supports you. Carl Jung had this idea that people need to find out, what supports you when nothing supports you. It's kind of paradoxical statement, isn't it? Because you think, what is that? But there's something about having a sense of that something does abide, that there isn't, not everything is, the provisionality doesn't necessarily mean that there's nothing real or there's nothing that abides. So if you think about like what does it mean to admit to yourself that your whole persona and your worldview is all provisional? What does it mean? It's like you're letting go of your identity. You're letting go of all this stuff. And if you have no sense of anything beyond that, then it's paramount to uh, annihilation, to complete annihilation, isn't it? I mean, that's everything. All there is. That's my persona, my sense of my belief about my self-image, my sense of self as someone who knows this and can do that, and this kind of person, or even your sense of other people and the world. If you have no sense of anything beyond that, then maybe that makes it more difficult to relinquish. I mean, it seems like that might be the case. Doesn't necessarily tell you how do you then get to this. How do you find out what supports you and nothing supports you? I mean, experience would say, or maybe Jung might say, you're sort of forced to that position. You find that out because you're dragged into the deep waters where nothing supports you, and maybe by some miracle you find you're still there somehow.
Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah.
it's there's something about, yeah, if you can have some, I suppose that's what the question, it's like a chicken and egg thing. It's like if we're talking about how would you, obviously you mentioned trauma, and I think that's universally recognized as a driver for individuation, for transformation, personal transformation. And it's also kind of obvious to people that you can't, there's some ethical problems with doing, to sort of doing that
Traumatized people.
consciously. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, as a way to enhance their individuation experience. So that's kind of
Yeah.
off the table. So there's a largely involuntary aspect of it. But going back to the work you're doing is like, how do you set up the conditions such that you maximize the potential and the opportunities and the chances for people to have these kind of experiences, or to get to a place where they can have this kind of self-knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm kind of wandering around a bit here, but
No, actually I think you're probably doing less wandering than you're aware of, because you've actually used, I think, terms that are germane directly to the work that I'm looking into. Is that you use the word transformation, and for me, transformation, the corollary, or the collaborator with transformation, which oftentimes can not feel collaborative, is the word transmigration. And so transmigration is oftentimes the technical term that's used for reincarnation. And I'm not exploring the religious exploration of reincarnation, but transmigration as itself is the persistence of the self. You use the word that there's something that abides. When there's no thing left, there's some, what is it that is there? And I think that's the nature of the transmigration. There's a persistence of the self. When I think back to myself as a 4-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 12-year-old, I know that's me, but it's not me. And that's the dance, right? Is like there's a part of me that has the transmigration of myself that says, yes, I was that person. There's a part of me that is carried forward, but there's also the transformation aspect, which is I'm a different person than that person was. And we even recognize this in our relationships with each other when we come along and we meet someone that we haven't seen in 20 or 30 years, and we say things like, well, you're a completely different person. We're recognizing that, well, part of our shock is like, we did know you, but we don't know you now just because you have the same name, or we recognize that we had similar memories. Like, we what do we recognize? And oftentimes that ends up being on ethical bases, right? Like we know of the high school bully that we show up and we anticipate we're gonna run into this person who is gonna still be just a bully at a different stage, and something has changed that we don't even recognize them because they're compassionate and kind, and something happened in between that. That's there's some transformative experience. And I think the philosopher Lori Paul, who I think she's now head of, or in a significant leadership position at Yale in their psychology department, she wrote a book called The Transformative Experience. And she talks about the nature of the transformative experience is that there's a version of ourselves prior that has certain knowledge, has an epistemology, has preferences, personal relationships to things, and then something happens, and after that, there is new knowledge and new preferences that could not have been acquired without that transformation. One of the biggest examples of that she used that I love, she actually talks about how you would make a decision on whether or not you want to become a vampire. She actually ends up equating that to, it's the same things that you would go about trying to decide. That's the same things that people use to try to decide whether they want to become parents. Like, how do you explain to somebody who's not a parent what it's like to be a parent? You once you're a parent, once you become that, once you've transformed into being that, you have a language within yourself. You have preferences. You have an experience, a subjective experience that we do not understand unless you're a parent. So how do you make a decision to become something that you can only make if you are that thing? It's you can't. You can ask people, you can try to accommodate your present self in figuring out what it would be like to be a parent. But if your preferences and your knowledge is fundamentally only going to have a language that exists as a parent, then you are ill equipped to make that decision. For me, this is the nature of us being persistent individuals, that we're trying to make decisions for future versions of ourselves that we actually don't know what their preferences and their knowledge is going to be. That's the transmigration aspect. I am beholden to the decisions that were made by a version of myself that I may not agree with today. I just, I might say, like, I wouldn't have made those decisions. Well, of course I wouldn't have made those decisions because I'm not that person. And yet there's aspects of me that are carried forward. I mean, this is a very heady way of looking at this experience. I think at its core, what I think that we are is creatures that are beholden to time, and we are in that transmigratory aspect of ourselves. We have to say we make the best decisions with what's most available to us in the present, here and now, based on what we've learned in the past and what we project into the future. But we must remember that at the end of the day, all of this, all of the experiences that we have are transformational. We are in process. There are things that are happening to us that are moving us to be something that we weren't 5 minutes, 5 years, 10 years ago. And that if we forget that, then we start to anchor and grip way too much onto this myth that we can project well enough on what we're going to want in the future, that we can project our present selves onto that in order to make perfect decisions. And I do believe that perfect is the enemy of the good. And we forget that oftentimes when we let the predominance of the transmigratory self, the persistent self, take control. That is, for me, that is the ego. That is the persona. The transformed self is more of that individuated self that says, I will become what I need to become based on what is needed and sufficient for the time in which I find myself. And that may be very different than what my persistent self, what my ego believes it wants to be for all time. And that's the messy answer that I have, that for a lot of people is deeply unsatisfactory, which I think points to the pictures, is that it's about our relationship to not knowing. It's about our relationship to uncertainty that continues to drive us in circles of trying to convince ourselves that we can know, that we can control, and therefore things are stable. Well, they are until they're not. And if there's anything about this world that we do know is that it's really good at destabilizing the things that we believe are monolithic. They're like, look, that is what's happening on a collective unconscious level within the United States. What percentage of the angst and anxiety is happening because people are coming to terms with the fact that what they believed, the institutions, the United States itself, and what it stood for, was this monolith that would last forever, that was handed down from on high. The myth of the United States was that it was God's chosen country and it would last forever. And now they're confronting with the fact that, oh, we're also subject to really bad human behavior, that maybe this thing could fall. Like people are coming to grips with the fact that nothing is certain.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's hard to disagree. It seems kind of very, very obvious to me, but that's the point, isn't it? It's like these things do seem obvious, but what does it take for a person to actually to come to that personal experience?
Yeah.
And it seems like maybe a lot of these wisdom traditions would say suffering, suffering of some kind. So I guess
It's why Jung's vision of of World War I, I think, is like it doesn't take a prophecy or some form of divination to see what he saw was archetypal patterns that have played out cyclically over time. And he just said, well, of course, I, trauma and suffering is what we invite that on ourselves when we forget and we skew to too far to one side.
yeah, and Jung, his story in particular, like you talk about the Red Book, and it's well known that this these experiences he had that ended up becoming the Red Book. They began around the same time where he had the break with Freud, and essentially the beginning of what now we would call a midlife crisis, and a very intense period of suffering, super intense. I mean, if you hear the descriptions in the his autobiography, there's this part where he had a loaded pistol in his nightstand, and he was threatening his unconscious, saying, "Look, you better figure this out. You better work this out, or I'm going to end it." So, I mean, that'll give you a sense of the intensity of the suffering he was going through, and uh, that's at the same time there's this idea that he had this dream. I forget the exact details of the dream, but it was to do with this archetypal hero called Siegfried.
Yep.
Is that rings a
Siegfried.
bell?
Yeah,
And
yeah. Siegfried was his hero. Yes.
yes,
Yeah.
so he had this dream that he and someone else were waiting to ambush Siegfried, and they killed Siegfried. And if you remember more of the dream, please please step
No,
in.
no, you keep going. If I need to fill anything, I'll tell you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But the essential details are he killed this guy, this mythological hero, Siegfried. And after the dream was over, when he woke up, he heard a voice in him saying, "You need to understand this dream. You need to understand it." I think there might have been even more to that. Might have been more. It was a very, very intense kind of injunction by his unconscious. You have to understand this. And ultimately, what he came to understand is that this Siegfried, this hero, represented in him his personal myth up until that point, which was the myth of the conquering hero. And so his midlife crisis turned around this point of where he had to let this personal myth, which he was identified with, it was seemingly was him from his point of view. He had to let that die in order for something new to come. And you could see that, this process of being able to relinquish, to let that part of you die, to see the provisional nature of that identity. It took a hell of a lot of suffering and you think Carl Jung, he was even then, I mean, he was very psychologically astute. He knew about the unconscious. And he's incredibly smart. He's a polymath. So if it's that difficult for him, how could we imagine it's going to be a walk in the park for anyone else, for an average person? So I
What
mean,
you just there's the thing about this is that a lot of people, I think, anchor to that story as that picture of you must slay your hero, right? Like
hmm,
it's you know he Jung in the Red Book refers to slaying the prince. Um, I mean, the Red Book is replete with archetypal and symbolic imagery, but The what people oftentimes also miss is that they make it sound like that slaying of the hero is what leads to individuation or into wholeness. When you actually go through the Red Book, he slays the hero first. He has that dream. And then he has another dream where he has to slay the god, Isbadur, which is Gilgamesh. And then after that, he has to slay what are called what he refers to as his Kabiri. He um, there's a trail of blood behind Jung. Like he's just slaying all aspects of his unconscious and parts of himself. Because what he really starts to get at is even just showing how quickly we replace, you know, the stolid nature of your hero, that very thing that was grounding for so long that you strove to become. Eventually you idolize and you have to slay it. Well, very quickly what comes on the heels of that is you have to come to the realization that as soon as you slayed that, you put a different idol in place. And so what he looks at it as, well, I slayed my hero, but then I had to slay my god. And then there were these people that were alongside me the entire time, helping me, carrying my stuff. And then I started to idolize them. And I actually had to slay the helpers themselves that got me through my dark night of the soul, got me to individual. And I can't, in order to get to the other side, I have to realize there is no ultimate other side. There is no point of arrival. I'm 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 having to I'm as being in process. My hero, my god, my Kabiri, they rise up and they serve me until they no longer serve me. And as long as I am holding them out as the things that I cannot relinquish, then they're actually my burden. They're the thing that I bear. And I must learn how to die to them. I must learn how to sacrifice them. And in so being, become the redeeming symbol. And this is why so much of Jung's imagery also goes towards the Christ figure. It's over and over and over again. He learns that he must kill the innocent within him, the thing that he thought was virtuous, and that eventually he must become that which climbs up onto the cross and dies to the vision of of self that he'd held out, was going to be the thing that made him happy, that brought him wholeness. So yeah, it's that your retelling of that. It's absolutely. He did that multiple times, and it was arduous every single time.
Yeah, and he didn't go there willingly. He didn't.
No.
He was forced there. He was dragged there, kicking and screaming.
Yeah.
And I mean, so that was, I guess, what I wanted to tie it back to was, so we know that about this process of transformation. Um, but tying it back to what your work is, how, like, how do you conceptualize when you talk about like creating conditions which will foster, which will sort of I can't even think of the right words in terms of what the idea of how do you how do you make that process easier? That doesn't even seem right to me to even because you can't really make it easier, can you? Or maybe,
Yeah.
I mean, not in, I mean, you can't avoid the necessary suffering, but maybe is it, would I be right in thinking it's something like the same way that, like I was saying at the start of the podcast, me finding out about these archetypal patterns that people go through, like the descent, the catabasis, the descent into Hades, and the, you know, coming across these stories somehow knocked me out of this sort of very neurotic, isolated sense of myself. And so it didn't necessarily make it easy, but it maybe it made the process more efficient. If that's these words don't seem appropriate, but
Yeah.
but it did
I think
something that was beneficial, you know?
yes, yeah. I think that the nature of, I mean, the nature of the language itself and the limitations of the language reflects the fact of, there is what we're describing, whether you whether you take kind of binary or dualistic model, yin and yang and or yin and yang and or male and female, or I think the other one is that the rational and the irrational, right? The rational is that the language is saying that we're taking these things that are very deep and part of the subjective experience, so that subjective experience, and we're trying to translate it into through the technology of language to make it make sense, to see if we're saying the same thing or can increase the confidence interval that we're saying the same thing. And so there's going to be a practical limitation because the irrational itself, the known that goes beyond words, doesn't disappear simply because we can't pick the right words to describe what it is. But I think this is where the power of what I think Jung started out with, going through the Red Book and the philosophy that underlied everything in his collected works. But one of those tools that I think was most powerful that continues to evolve is active imagination and what it means. If Jung would say that we need helpers, we need analysts, we need people who have gone before, who know how to navigate the realms here. But let's keep in mind that Jung did a lot of this on his own. That doesn't mean that everybody is capable of doing that. You just outlined all of the aspects of Jung that made him a very unique individual. But what was he doing and how did he navigate that? From his active imagination, it wasn't just dream analysis. It wasn't just art in the traditional sense that a lot of ways that is applied now, extending into music therapy, into art therapy, play therapy, other manifestations of active imagination have evolved. Jung's was returning to something he did as a child, taking stones and building small cities out of small stones, little models. I I have taken that model of active imagination and the practical aspect of it, of tilling the soil, of creating the conditions. I take with this very vision or inward looking approach to hobbies, whether that's woodworking or ceramics or community gardening or doing things where you're bumping up against your unconscious. Because I'll tell you, when you're first learning how to plane a piece of lumber square and you've got a hand plane and you're doing it by hand, and it's not doing what you want it to do, and that frustration is coming up. What is coming up? It's coming up my unconscious beliefs of my relationship to this activity actually is. That I believe that what my will, that I can impel this thing that is likely older than I am, this tree that's been around longer and seen more than I have, that I believe I can dominate it to do what I want to do. Well, in the process, I have a choice. I can either become aware of what's coming up inside of me, because the wood is not provoking me. It doesn't have an agenda that it's saying, hey, I'm going to make you pissed off today. And it's not doing that. I'm doing that to myself. And so in that activity, I think that is the nature of active imagination, is creating something out there, interacting with it, letting something emerge from that, and then taking the step back and cultivating the skills and the abilities to acknowledge, to observe, to see what comes up that sneaks up on us and surprises us. And sometimes we need to do that in different domains. And that's why for a lot of the work that I'm going to be doing is focusing on bringing people together to go and community garden and to see that, hey, we've been cultivating this tomato plant for the last 3 weeks and it's starting to die. And do we start getting frustrated and we start blaming ourselves or blaming other people that says like we did it wrong, or do we start saying like, no, it's communicating to us. It's telling us, do we have the presence of mind to cultivate the language that we have to actually hear what it's saying to us? I do horsemanship work as well. I train horses and start colts, and it's the same thing. can I actually, am I coming to that instance of bumping into this creature that has a mind of its own? Am I trying to impose it? Which is why I can't use the word breaking the horse, or, I, because that's me dominating. That's my agenda. Or do I start to learn how to listen, to hear what this collaborator has to say to me? And I think that's the big part of just pragmatically getting to the application of what we're trying to do, is say we have to cultivate listening, humility, self-compassion, grace, understanding, in order to start hearing the dialogue that's already happening beyond the noise of our own domination. And none of this is new. There is wisdom traditions that have been exploring these topics for millennia, and Jung was just, I think, one of the best, most recent examples of updating the language of wisdom traditions into something modern that we can reach for. And that's what we're exploring. How do we bring that more into the zeitgeist, more into the model for how we continue to learn how to be human?
Okay. On that note, I think that's a great place to end the podcast.
Awesome. Awesome.
I think it's been a really, really good conversation. I've enjoyed it a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah. I
Um,
enjoyed it as well.